Catherine Abreu is with us this morning. She's the executive director and the founder of Destination Zero, which is an organization very much focused on creating a fossil-free future. Catherine is in Ottawa this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
You were listening to David's reporting. I'd like to begin, if I could, with a sort of an overall statement of characterization. What's your response, your reaction to the budgetary measures for the green economy, Catherine, overall?
So with this budget, we're really seeing a pretty unprecedented investment from the Canadian federal government in clean energy, in green industry. Whether that investment is high enough, I think, is a legitimate question. It doesn't reach the 2% of GDP that some groups were calling for this climate budget. And whether these market mechanisms that the government is banking on are going to work is another question. But certainly the investment levels are historic from a Canadian perspective. And now we kind of have to see whether Canada can put the plans in place to make sure that investment does what it's supposed to do.
Okay, so you're looking ahead to next steps, and we'll do that at the conclusion. When you talk about market mechanisms, are you talking about the fact that much of this is taking the form of tax credits? So we have this $21 billion nearly over the 5 years, mostly in tax credits, which seems to be a real shift in strategy, economic incentives to meet emissions targets. What do you think of them as a tool, tax credits?
Yeah, that's right. We're seeing a shift from an approach of kind of direct subsidies, so the government putting public dollars directly to projects that it thinks matters in the race to net zero, to creating these kind of market incentive programs. And that's putting a big bet on the market to make good decisions about climate and a net zero economy in Canada. And maybe that bet will pay off. But this is why we keep saying there's a need for a plan. And, you know, I'm also a member of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body, which is it gives advice to the Minister of Climate Change on how to meet our net zero commitment. And we've said we need industrial strategies, plans that help us get to this clean economy. And so we've got some market incentives in place. Whether we have the right plans to make sure those incentives put us in the right direction, I think, is another question.
Okay, so that's still a missing piece for you. So much of these tax credits are devoted at the grid, the clean electricity grid. Canada with a plan to have a net zero electricity grid by 2035 and the push to have an east-west grid. Do you think that these credits will really, that foundational piece, will they help us get there?
Yeah, so I think it's really good to see the government focusing on grid decarbonization, because having a clean electricity grid is really the underpinning of our ability to decarbonize other sectors. If we want to be bringing emissions down in large industry, we need to be doing that with a clean electricity grid that can electrify some of that industry's operations. So makes sense to start there. Will this get the build out of energy infrastructure from east to west that we desperately need in this country to move electrons? I think that will come down to some extent on how the provinces react to this budget. And it's interesting to see that these mechanisms are not just trying to crowd in private sector funding into the clean industry in Canada. We're also seeing Canada, the federal government, say, hey, in order to access some of these tax credits, we need the provinces to be committing to that 2035 decarbonization date for the grid as well. So I think we're also seeing this budget trying to get other parts of the equation contributing their money to this issue. And I think that's why we're seeing this kind of new approach from the government.
Not just private, but public entities as well eligible for these tax credits to move them in that direction. Right. You heard in David's report, again, so much of the impetus for these budgetary measures was coming from the Biden administration and the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these tax credits and subsidies there that people were very concerned would draw the capital away from Canada, draw all of the green capital. Do you think that the measures announced yesterday will in fact level the playing field?
Yeah, so I do think that we've seen some measures that will go a long way to leveling the playing field for clean energy and green industry in Canada. Rather than comparing what we see in Budget 2023 to the Inflation Reduction Act, I think we need to ask, is what we've seen as transformative for Canada as the Inflation Reduction Act is for the United States? And in order for it to be that transformative, it needs to be taking us in a direction. So what's that end point? And that's why this emphasis on where our priorities are. What are these sectors specifically that we're trying to grow? And I think there's a little more detail required on that. That being said, interestingly enough, something that we have taken from IRA and other jurisdictions is this understanding that climate policy, fiscal policy, and labor policy, all of those things actually have to go together. And so I think also really important to see labor standards being attached to those investment tax credits, which mirrors some of what we're seeing in the United States. So not only are we seeing an uplift in investment into green industry and clean energy, but also a prioritization of good, decent work and labor standards within that move.
It's so interesting. That was going to be my final question. So obviously it's on your mind, this notion of the biggest incentives to companies that pay well, that offer, 10% of these positions have to be for apprentices to encourage the work in the skilled trade. This incorporating of labor standards, it sounds like you're in favor of that strongly.
Yeah, absolutely. At this point in 2023, I think we're seeing that successful governments understand policies, fiscal measures have to be innovative. They have to deliver on a variety of metrics at the same time. In part, what these metrics should be delivering on that we didn't really see in Budget 2023 is a transformation away from fossil fuel dependence. And unfortunately, we did see this budget continuing to funnel public dollars into fossil fuels like gas. And so, in order to have that transformative effect, we need to stop pumping money into the dirty energy, and we need to have a plan. But I do think Budget 2023 puts us on that path. So a few more elements to get right, but good to see some significant historic investments being made with this budget.